The throne was never just a seat of power. It was a mirror, polished in gold, but fractured beneath, and when some kings peered into it, they saw monsters. In the heavy silence of a royal chamber, a king paces barefoot on floors smeared with blood, not his enemies, but his own. Down the corridor, another king refuses to eat unless his servants crawl on all fours, barking like dogs. And beyond a veil of incense and silk, a ruler drinks the tears of virgins, believing it makes him invincible. We remember kings as wise, gallant, or ruthless. But we rarely pause to ask, what happens when absolute power meets absolute madness? When royal decrees are shaped not by strategy or statecraft, but by unhinged obsession? Behind the tapestries and the triumphs, history kept its mouth shut. It buried the grotesque, the perverse, the unthinkable, but madness leaves a scent. It drips from the margins of royal chronicles, staining them with whispered rumors and frantic court scribbles, the wine they drank, the rituals they demanded, the bodies they left behind. Today, we strip away the legend. We enter the inner sanctums where empires trembled not from war, but from the unstable minds of their kings. This is not a gallery of oddities. It is a descent into the brutal psychology of absolute power. And the 7 men who wore crowns not like symbols, but like curses. He liked to watch them run, barefoot senators, old men, once orators, now panting dogs, sprinting beside his chariot as it thundered through the palace corridors. Sandals lost, robes flying, hearts pounding under layers of sweat-soaked silk. Some cried, some collapsed. He would laugh, then grow quiet, eyes distant, as if haunted by the sound of hooves not yet echoing. They called him Caligula. But even his name was a lie, a boyhood nickname from the army camps, Little Boots, a joke in leather and brass. His real name, Gaius, disappeared the day his father's blood soaked into the blades of his uncles. A child emperor forged, not in ascension, but in absence. No mother, no brothers, no softness, only Rome and Rome's cruel eyes. He was not mad when he took the throne. Not yet. At first, they cheered. A fresh face, a familiar lineage. Applause echoed in marble halls. Doves released. Prayers offered. The empire exhaled. But then he began to change. He whispered to statues at night, deep in the colonnades, his voice trembling, as if pleading with the gods or threatening them. He stopped blinking when addressed, as if trying to see through those who spoke. He declared himself divine, not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. Jupiter incarnate, Apollo reborn, a living god in purple and gold. He built a temple to himself. Slaves dragged in animals for sacrifice, then virgins, then lovers, and still he felt nothing. Worship never fed him. Adoration never warmed him. So he demanded more. He ordered priests to offer incense to his image daily, under threat of death. He made the Senate vote not on law, but on how best to honor him: bronze bust or marble statue, choir or flute procession. He didn't care for their answers. He cared that they trembled. He laughed when they bowed too low. He sneered when they bowed too little. Some nights, he wept behind a curtain of gold beads, speaking to a sister-long, dead, swearing she answered. Other nights, he dressed her in his mind, painting her skin with the perfume of memory. His grief, like his mind, wandered unchained, but madness is not loud. Not always. Sometimes it walks gently, barefoot across the polished stone, humming lullabies only the broken remember. Sometimes it wears a laurel crown. His horse, the pale creature named Incitatus, became consul, not symbolically, not ceremonially. Guards bowed to it. Servants fed it oats mixed with flakes of gold. A villa was built for the beast. Visitors were told to consult it for counsel. They laughed at first, then they stopped, because to laugh at the horse was to mock the god who named it holy. And in Caligula's Rome, the gods were watching. He began to fear the moon. He forbade anyone to mention it in his presence. Mirrors were removed. He believed his own reflection was plotting against him, a twin sent by Neptune to dethrone him. At meals, he sometimes sat alone, gesturing as if an invisible crowd dined with him. No one asked questions, not after the first senator was flayed for inquiring. What he feared most was silence. It reminded him of the island, the years between his father's murder and his rise, locked rooms, whispers through walls, eyes that looked away too quickly. He learned then that silence meant forgetting, and forgetting was a kind of death. So he filled the silence with spectacle. Orgies staged as religious rites, public executions disguised as theater. One day, he slit a man's throat mid-performance, then applauded the blood like it was music. He did not become a god. He became the shadow gods refused to name. And still, Rome bowed, not because they believed, but because fear has its own kind of faith. And in Caligula's reign, worship wasn't love, it was survival. It began with a breeze, not a storm, not a scream, just a breeze, brushing against the tapestries in the corridor, lifting the hem of a cloak, unsettling the flame of a single candle. And he froze. Charles stood still as marble, eyes glassed, hands clenched, chest rigid beneath the heavy folds of fur-lined velvet. The whisper of air against his sleeve was enough. Enough to awaken the terror. He believed he would shatter. His courtiers dared not move. Breath held, eyes lowered. They had learned the rituals of his fear. No sudden motions, no gestures above the waist, no voices louder than silk on stone. Because to startle the king was to risk his disintegration, he told them, often urgently, and without irony, that his body was made of glass, that a stumble could splinter him, that a touch could break his arms, that if they dropped him, he would never be whole again. And they believed him, not because it made sense, but because power does not require logic, only obedience. They reinforced his robes with iron stays, lined his chambers with padded walls. Some nights he slept in straw, like a fragile vase wrapped for transport. Servants were ordered to walk backward when they left his presence, lest their heel catch and send him shivering into shards. And still he wept. His crown weighed more than metal. It pressed into his skull like a branding iron, searing through reason, language, memory. He had once spoken fluently. Now words clotted behind his teeth. Sentences spilled like cracked wine cups. There were days he forgot his wife's name, then his children's, then his own. They called him mad. But madness implies chaos. This was slower, quieter, like fog swallowing a village bell. You could scream and still not be heard. The kingdom watched. Then it waited. Then it fractured, while he whispered to mirrors and flinched at reflections. France tore itself in half. Brother turned against brother. Nobles carved the land into rival banners. And still, Charles clutched at his ribs in terror, convinced his own bones would betray him. There was once a day, cold, pale, brittle, when a page boy brushed his shoulder by accident. Charles screamed so violently that blood vessels burst. In his eyes, the boy was never seen again. Some said he was exiled. Others said he was buried beneath the floorboards, so the king would not hear the echo of his footsteps again. The palace learned to echo differently: soft shoes, blank stares, shallow bows. A language made of silence. Sometimes Charles wandered through corridors that bent like hallucinations, through gardens where roses bloomed and wilted in the same hour. He murmured to birds, to shadows, to his own fingers. On especially lucid mornings, he asked where his father had gone. They lied gently. They told him the king was resting. They never said, "You are the king." Because some lies are kinder than mirrors, he aged without memory, grayed without knowing it. When rain struck the stained glass, he wept, begging it not to break. He believed the sky was crying on his behalf, that even the heavens feared what he had become. They called him Charles the Mad, but madness was never the enemy. It was the kingdom's only refuge, from a crown that crushed its bearer, from a Sinzi war that wore no face, from the unbearable weight of being seen and still not known. And behind it all, always waited the mirror, silent, whole, watching, waiting for the day it would finally shatter. The air was heavy with smoke and salt. Thick, damp, iron-scented, it clung to the lungs like grief. Somewhere beneath the drums, beneath the chanting, beneath the firelight that danced like devils on the bark of trees, a silence pulsed. A waiting silence. Not absence, but hunger. The body had not yet cooled, stripped of name, rank, rebellion, cleanly flayed, laid upon red cloth. The priest did not cry. The king never blinked. Around them, acolytes in oiled skins swayed, their faces painted in streaks of ash and ochre, the way one prepares not for war, but for judgment. He was called Mwenda Mutiba, but his people rarely said the name aloud. Not at night, not when the moon was bruised, not when the wind shifted. They called him Wata Yamvo, ruler of fire and bone, the crowned eater, the king whose mouth knew no lie and no mercy. He did not kill for hunger. He killed for order, for hierarchy, for memory. The right was old, older than language, older than borders. When a rival threatened the lineage, his body was not merely defeated, it was absorbed. His essence swallowed, his defiance chewed into silence. His flesh became prophecy. The devouring was not savage. It was sacred. Mwenda did not feast with savagery. He consumed with reverence. A slice for each virtue the dead had once claimed. One for cunning, one for courage, one for disobedience. Ritualized, measured, revered. The tongue was last, so the soul would forget how to curse. They say he spoke to the bones, that after the fires died down, he would sit among the charred fragments, still in his robe of white feathers and copper rings, whispering, listening, asking questions that no one else dared answer, sometimes laughing, sometimes weeping, and yet no man dared turn away, because to look into his eyes was to see a world where morality was not fixed. It was eaten and reborn. The palace was not built of marble or mirrors, but red stone and saltwood. Its doors were carved with faces, some weeping, some blank. Its floors bore the stains of centuries. The scent of blood never left. It mingled with incense, with burning palm oil, with the earthy weight of fermented maize. Even the air bent differently inside. Time moved slower, like it was afraid to pass. The women spoke little. Their hair shaved in rings, their steps patterned like mourning. They were his shadows, mothers, widows, daughters of men who had vanished in the king's judgment. They washed the blades. They anointed the skin. They sang when others could. He was not hated. That was the strangest thing. There was awe, fear, a reverence so deep it carved silence into every threshold. Because Mwenda was not merely a man. He was the embodiment of the Lunda cycle, devour to dominate, dominate to preserve. A human god sharpened by terror, and yet even gods decay. There were nights he walked alone through the outer ring, barefoot in the mud, his robes trailing like smoke. He would pause by the shrines, fingers tracing the skulls mounted above each gate. Some were polished smooth. Some still bore the gold teeth of princes. They say he wept on those nights, not out of guilt, but because hunger never leaves, it merely changes its face, and somewhere, deep in the root of his belly, he feared a future where no more rivals remained, no more threats to consume, only silence, and a mouth that still needed to feed. There was no sound in the courtyard but the ticking of water. Droplets from the tiled roof slipped down in slow rhythm, tapping against the stone basin, steady as a monk's breath. The rain had passed, but the scent of it lingered, petrichor, and pine, wet silk, old wood. Near the edge of the palace wall, a chest sat beneath a thin canopy. Squared, bound, sealed inside, someone was still alive. The boy had once been a prince. His name was Suddo. He had worn robes stitched in phoenix thread, bowed before scholars with trembling reverence, studied characters until his fingers ached from ink. But he had also laughed once, hidden peaches in the garden, chased servants in mock battle. He had asked once, quietly, why his father never smiled. Yangzhou, the king, the reformer, the Confucian sage, answered not with warmth, but with ceremony. Obedience was love. Silence was respect. Filial duty was salvation. So when Seido's laughter grew too loud, too strange, too desperate, when his hands shook before the rites, when he screamed at shadows or fell trembling in the hall, Yangzhou looked away, not out of cruelty, but because the cracks in his son's mind did not fit the order of the world he had built. A king could pardon sin, but not disorder. The court whispered of madness, of fits and fury, of bloodied clothes and weeping eunuchs. Some stories were true, others were sharpened by faction knives. But Yangzhou did not ask. He saw a sun who refused to become a mirror, and in a palace of mirrors, that was a kind of treason dot. So he summoned the chest. It was simple, square, unadorned. No blades, no fire, just a wooden box and the weight of a father's will. They carried Seido to it, bound in cloth, eyes wild. No trial, no charge, just the ritual written in ink and silence. He begged. He did not kneel. There was no time. He called for his mother, for the concubines, for the sky. He called for his father last. But the king had already turned his back. The lid shut, and the world forgot him. 8 days of rice rotting. By his side, of breath turning to fever, of nails tearing at the grain, of prayer turning to madness. The chest was placed outside the king's private quarters, where he could hear, or choose not to. Some said Yangzhou paced those nights, steps, slow, uneven, ritualistic, that he recited Confucian verses until his voice cracked, that he watched the chest from a distance, his hands tucked inside his sleeves like they were hiding blood. When it ended, he did not weep. He held court the next morning, flawless in his robes, his voice composed, his rulings wise. Ministers bowed, deeper than before. No one spoke the prince's name. The chest was burned, the ashes scattered beneath a willow tree where no birds ever sang again. He had preserved the dynasty. He had executed disorder. And yet, in the years that followed, Yangzhou aged like rotting lacquer. His skin dimmed. His posture stooped. His prayers grew longer. He spoke often of shadows, how they followed, how they multiplied, how they whispered when the lanterns dimmed. There were no portraits of Seido in the halls, only silence, and the scent of pine, and the faint, remembered tapping of water. He never quite knew what to do with the living. They moved too quickly. Their eyes held questions. Their mouths opened without permission. But the dead, they were quiet, still, faithful. They didn't laugh at him when he stammered through military drills alone in his chamber. They didn't wince when he clutched his wooden sword too tightly, knuckles pale as the dolls he dressed in uniforms. Peter, the tsar in name, the boy in mind, preferred wax to blood. He whispered to figurines of Prussian infantry, addressed them as gentlemen, and wept when one was chipped. In the palaces of St. Petersburg, where frost etched sorrow onto every windowpane. Servants stepped lightly around his staged parades. Terrified to breathe too loudly near the barracks he had built in his drawing room, he crowned a rat once, executed another for treason. He called it discipline. Catherine, his wife, watched in silence. She smiled, as one does at a child holding a blade. Behind the smile, she counted days. The court sneered behind heavy curtains. Ministers turned their faces. Peter rarely noticed. He was too busy polishing the buttons of his toy regiment, arranging them in battle formations across carpets stained with wine and candle grease. He spoke to them in German, not Russian. Never Russian. At night, he did not sleep alone. There were rumors, always rumors, that he slept beside an embalmed body, that he pressed his lips against cold cheeks and whispered commands to rib cages sealed in resin, that he had coffins delivered and opened them just to stare. Some said he practiced autopsies on pigs. Others said it wasn't always pigs. The scent in his chambers lingered, bitter herbs, old linen, something metallic. He did not govern. He performed. Edicts were handed down like lines in a play he had not rehearsed. His guards grew uneasy. Foreign dignitaries exchanged glances. No one followed him, not because they feared him, but because there was nothing to follow. Power, when hollow, makes a sound. He filled it with pantomime. One day, he burst into court wearing a soldier's tunic 2 sizes too large, dragging a drum behind him. He demanded his ministers kneel and declare loyalty not to him, but to the great Frederick. Laughter rippled through the hall, quickly swallowed. Catherine stood at the far end, her hands folded, her eyes still. He mistook the silence for obedience. He always had, even in bed. He craved approval more than pleasure. He asked Catherine to watch him march, to applaud when he saluted, to lie still, always still, like his beloved wax companions. She did, for a time, but something shifted when the court stopped laughing, when they began to nod quietly behind closed doors, when whispers turned to oaths, when stillness became strategy. He never saw the blade coming. He saw her when the coup unfolded. He fled not with a sword, but with letters, pleas for pardon, cries of confusion. He begged for his wife, called her my Catherine, until the Yasserin moment she took his throne and left his name behind like an old garment, heavy with dust and shame. They say he died in a cellar. Others say it was quieter. A pillow, a push, a mercy. No autopsy was recorded, no figure was embalmed, and yet the room where he died remained cold long after. The scent never left, something between perfume and rot, like a nursery that had never been lived in. Peter wanted to be remembered, but memory is cruel to those who never learned how to live, and the dead keep no promises. The stench came before the king did, a musk of sweat and spoiled linen, spiced with the metallic tongue of unwashed flesh. The courtiers knew the scent. They had learned to hold their breath when he entered, not out of disgust, but uncertainty. Because Christian did not knock, he burst, he moaned, he touched himself. Sometimes he laughed when no one else was speaking. Sometimes he wept into the folds of his own sleeve and asked, in a voice like a boy's, if the devil still lived in his mirror. They bowed anyway, because to be ruled by madness was still to be ruled. Christian VII of Denmark did not govern. He wandered through halls once built for statecraft, now echoing with groans and muttering. He rolled his eyes in court, fidgeted during council, scratched himself through his breeches, while foreign ambassadors looked on in silence. Once he leapt onto a dining table, stripped to the waist, and performed a parody of a priest giving last rites. No one laughed, except him. His skin was pale, slick, fingernails bitten raw, hair thinned by his own hands. He spoke often of ghosts, old kings who whispered from fireplaces, women who climbed into his bed and vanished at dawn. He believed his fingers were cursed. He refused to touch his own son. And yet he could not stop touching himself. At night, he paced. Naked, some said, muttering names of men no one recognized. The guards learned not to look him in the eye, not because they feared punishment, but because there was something in that. Gaze, not rage, not grief, something closer to vacancy. A hollow where royalty should have lived. The country did not fall. It shifted. A doctor arrived, soft-spoken, precise, named Struensee. He diagnosed the king with melancholy, prescribed gentle authority, became his voice, his steward, then his. Shadow, and then his queen's lover, Christian, watched. He did not protest. Perhaps he never understood. Struensee took the reins of the realm, banned torture, reformed schools, translated new ideas across parchment like they were medicine. And behind him, Christian scratched at scabs and counted the tiles on the floor. The Enlightenment came not by decree, but by substitution. Denmark glowed. Briefly, and then it burned. The court grew jealous. The queen grew bold. The doctor grew visible. Whispers turned into knives. Struensee was arrested in his sleep. The queen screamed as they dragged him away. Christian stared at the fireplace and asked if the ghosts were cold. They took Struensee's hands first. Then his head. The queen was sent to exile. The king remained, or at least the shell of him. He wandered those same halls now lined with dust, repeating the doctor's name like a hymn. No one answered. No one dared. He lived decades more, unseen, unheard, unclean, not a tyrant, not a ruler. Something else entirely. A man who had touched the throne but never understood it, who had worn the crown like a toy and mistaken its silence for love. A king in name, in shadow, in absence, and Denmark somehow kept breathing. He liked to disappear, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. No farewell, no announcement. Just the quiet swing of lacquered doors and the echo of laughter that didn't sound quite real. The imperial court would freeze. Ministers held there. Breath. The empire waited. Zhengd was gone. He called it patrolling the realms. His guards called it madness. His eunuchs, who knew better, called it ritual. He would ride out dressed as a merchant or a soldier or a wandering monk. Silk robes traded for rough hemp, sashes loosened, hair unbound. He renamed himself each time, some mockery of identity, as though shedding his crown would strip the dust of duty from his skin. But he was never truly alone. Behind him trailed shadows, not just guards, but performers, spies, actors, slaves. They built entire cities for him, entire fictions. Streets filled with vendors who had no goods, children who had no homes, concubines who had no names. He played the hero in every tale. He rescued virgins from bandits he had hired, judged trials between men whose crimes he had written, walked among the people who dared not look him in the eye because they'd been told not to, because they didn't exist until he invented them. It was theater, but in Zhengdi's world, theater was the only thing still breathing. Inside the forbidden city, reality rotted. Edicts went unsigned. Floods drowned provinces. Famines silenced villages. But the palace was loud. Loud with laughter, music, shrieks. Eunuchs wrestled in oil. Dwarfs danced with swords. Monkeys served wine. An entire shadow government made of jesters, drunkards, and loyal fools replaced the men who once governed. He called it freedom. They called it sickness. At night, he prayed to mirrors, not to gods, not to ancestors, to his reflection. He called it the Ghost Prince. He asked it if he was still real. Sometimes it blinked back at him. Sometimes it didn't. He once ordered all mirrors removed from the palace, only to beg them returned 3 days later, claiming the walls had begun to whisper in their absence. He drank until he forgot his own handwriting. He summoned concubines by number, not by name. They wept behind silk veils. Some bled, some vanished. He did not ask where they went. He did not remember their faces. The deeper he fled into fantasy, the more the empire collapsed under its own silence. But the ministers did not rebel. They performed. They bowed. They stitched new ceremonies to honor the illusion. Because to challenge the play was to admit the actor had died, and Zhengd, the real Zhengd, had died long before, not by poison, not by blade, but by obedience. He had been trained since birth to be sacred, perfect, still. His words were scripture, his breath prophecy, every gesture choreographed by ancient books and trembling teachers. There was no room to feel, no time to break. So he escaped, not with his feet, but with his mind. He did not rule. He ran into lies, into spectacle, into sin, not to destroy the empire, but because it was the only way he knew how to survive it. And in the end, he vanished again. But this time, he never came back. Only silence remained, heavy, dust thick, watching as if the mirror was still waiting for him to return. They were not born monsters. They were born boys, some with soft hands, some with names already etched in stone. And before they could choose, before they could speak in full sentences, the weight of nations was placed on their heads. Gold, yes, but also iron. The crown is a circle, no edges, no exit. It glitters from afar, but up close it leaves bruises, pressure behind the eyes, silence in the throat, rituals that crush the lungs. It teaches obedience before empathy, power before touch, and in that silence, madness grows, not always suddenly. Sometimes like ivy, creeping, curling, weaving itself through bone and blood until the man and the myth can no longer be separated. One spoke to mirrors. One swallowed his rivals. One hid inside fantasy and called it governance. Some ruled with blood, others with absence, but none ruled freely. They were trapped within rituals older than themselves, swallowed by expectations they never authored, crowned by dynasties that broke them before they bloomed. History remembers them as grotesques. It laughs, points, closes the chapter, but cruelty does not begin with a madman. It begins with the machine that makes madness sacred, with a throne that asks not who you are, but what you must destroy to sit upon it, with courtiers who obey because survival tastes better than dissent, with cities that learn to kneel before decay because it's safer than questioning the smell. And so we do not end with mockery, we end with grief, for the men who shattered under golden halos, for the nations that bowed to empty vessels, for thee. Truth that power, unchallenged, will always rot from within. The crown did not fit them, because the crown fits no one. It only waits for the next neck soft enough to bear it.